You're listening to Sox in the Basement, a production of the Broadcast Basement Limited, where every show is 30 minutes of good and comes from a basement bar on the south side of Chicago. Pull up a stool, pour a cold one, and join us right now for Sox in the Basement. Heard everywhere podcasts can be found, and always at soxinthebasement.com. Elijah Evans from Just Baseball and FutureSox analyzing the draft coming up here in just a little bit on Sox in the Basement. And do not forget to mark your calendars August 9th. Myself, Chirizi E. and My Sox Summer from the 108 combining into a three-person panel live before all of you right before the White Sox take on the Cubs. A big party at Cork and Kerry at the Park. 33rd and Princeton in the shadow of the ballpark. It kicks off at 5 p.m. Do not miss it. This will not be aired. There may be some clips that you'll hear if we gather anything from there. But if you want to check out this experience, we're bringing in guests. We're going to have giveaways. Should be a blast. Kicking off at 5 at Cork and Kerry at the Park on August the 9th to kick off Sox Cubs. Cork and Kerry at the Park. See more at corkandkerry.com. My friend...
You know, I haven't talked to Beefloaf about this, but I think we're going to ask Cork and Kerry at the Park to save up all their rotten tomatoes and lettuce from their award-winning burgers, just so we have stuff to give away to throw at you guys while you're up on the stage.
Anything that's left over, like scraps that came off of somebody's plate, so that you can throw them at us because you're jealous that you're not up there. I understand. I get it.
No, we're not jealous that we're not up there. We're just looking for something to do. That's all.
Maybe we'll do an Ed and Beefloaf event later on, because the two of you got left out of this. Maybe that's what we'll do. I don't know. We'll have to see. We'll have to see if there's interest in that. I don't know if there will be.
We'll see how popular we are.
All right. The White Sox go through the draft. Elijah Evans is going to break it all down for us here in a little bit. I want to talk about the first round draft choice, though, Hagen Smith, because I think that selection, in the face of what we talked about with James Fox, their tendency to look towards high school players, which they did later on in the draft, and the fact that they needed hitting. You know, the perception is the White Sox needed hitting, and they needed to have more versatility, and they needed to find position players because they are a premium and they are hard to find. Most systems are pitching heavy. A lot of pitching talent out there, hard to find, ready to get to the majors, close to the majors, or just high-end prospects that are their position players, that are hitters. And you would think that's what they were going to do, and instead they go with a big left-handed pitcher out of college that's so good that he could start next year on this team. Like, this could be one of those quick arrival things that we've seen before. Chris Sale got here early as a reliever, and you saw Garrett Crochet get here, and you could see the same path for this kid, or even he ends up in the starting rotation in the back half of next year. Like, this is a guy who's polished enough. Brian Bannister may be sitting there saying, here we go, another pitcher to add into the big mess of pitchers that we have. And I think that selection tells you so much about what this team's overall philosophy is at this moment with Chris Getz. I think Chris Getz realizes his owner is cheap and is going to do something that I have yelled for years that Rick Hahn and Kenny Williams wouldn't do. And that is accept that Jerry Reinsdorf is never going to pay to keep pitching around. So you have to attack it as a general manager by going after controllable, good pitching, be so saturated with it that you don't have to worry about him ever having to pay for it. And then you can use the money for position players. And that was my first reaction when I saw that, is we just keep getting richer on the pitching side. We have Brian Bannister. We have all this pitching. This is what we're going to be. They're going to have to spend on hitting, though, with this philosophy.
Yeah, no, I saw a lot of people who sat there and said, well, Garrett Crochet is definitely on his way out because Hagen Smith is Garrett Crochet. And honestly, when I saw a video of Hagen Smith, the first thing I thought of was like really good Carlos Rodon, not Carlos Rodon where body parts are hanging off of him metaphorically, but like the one that threw the no-hitter, that guy. I had the same thought. He could be here really, really quickly. And you know, he's a guy, I mean, led the NCAA with in terms of K per 9 innings, struck out 17 against Oregon, which is, you know, top team in the NCAA. Hagen Smith is the goods. At least he looks it. You know, you can never tell. But I think part of this is too, you know, you mentioned that hitting prospects have been harder to come by because they come up and they tend to struggle. We've seen a lot of that where you get a lot of ballyhooed hyped prospects and they come up and it's not so great. I mean, you look at Baltimore and Colton Cowser's not great. Going into this year, the Rangers were all excited because they had Wyatt Langford, and then they had Evan Carter, and it's like we got a couple of young stud outfielders, and neither of them have really panned out. And it's all over the majors that way, where young hitters are struggling. And some of that, there's a thought that they're not getting proper exposure in the minors. They're seeing a lot of guys who are hard throwers and these pitching prospects that are all arm and stuff. And they're not seeing guys that know how to pitch to them, and they're not seeing stuff like that. So AAA, for example, is worthless because it's like taking batting practice. And we've seen some of those numbers get inflated, so there's some truth to that. But the other thing is that you could field a team of Tommy Phams, right? You could field a team of guys who are professional veteran hitters who aren't flashy, who aren't superstars, and have a really good chance offensively every game to string together hits and steal bases and take the extra base and get on without necessarily blowing guys out of the water. But if you have a good pitching staff, and if you have a deep pitching staff, you can sustain that. The other thing to remember too is that pitching prospects are great, but a lot of them end up getting hurt in some way, shape, or form. There's a lot of guys that get Tommy John in the minors that come out of college or come out of high school, and they've been overused a little bit, or there's something that they're trying to do, something new. They're encouraged to get more spin on the ball. They're encouraged to get a little bit more velocity. They change their mechanics a little bit to try and do stuff, and it ends up impacting their arms. So you've got guys that might need some time there to adjust, or might need some time to marinate. So stacking pitching, as a lot of organizations, like you pointed out, a lot of them are stacking pitching. Not a lot of them are stacking hitting. One, you can use the pitching to get the hitting, but two, I also feel like there's a lot more that you can do trying to fill up the positions on the field than there is when you're on a limited budget, and when you have a guy that won't pay to extend guys and keep them around, than there is to keep a pitching staff together for year in and year out. You're going to have to funnel through a lot of pitchers year in and year out when you're only limited to like Eric Fetty style contracts.
The thing is, to get the good quality pitchers, you have to give those multi-year things. It's not as much money as he just won't give the multi-year thing. You can get hitters on 3-year contracts more easily than you can get pitchers on 3-year contracts that are of quality. Like, if you look at these things, pitchers get, I feel like, just as somebody who's been watching it for the last couple of years, you take a much greater risk and add many more years than you'd like to, and you are paying more AAV, like average annual value, for pitchers a lot when you're going and getting like that high quality guy where you might be able to find a really good hitter and not have to go that length. I mean, they weren't the best offer for Manny Machado, but they at least were up there around like $250 million. I mean, they mishandled it, but I've never seen him even consider spending that much for a pitcher. So he's never going to get the front line guys that come walking out with Scott Boras as their agent. Like, that's not what he's going to be able to do. And so this is why it would make far more sense if you're a general manager and this is your owner to say, okay, we have to stop even thinking we're ever going to be out there able to get the best pitchers, that number 1 or number 2 that comes in there and leads your staff. It's just not something we can do with this ownership, but we can try to develop that. We can saturate so much that if we have 20 or 30 possible guys that could be that, if a couple of them work out, we've found it. Plus you get capital. I mean, they can overpay in the offseason. They can go to a team and say, look, we're going to give you two good pitching prospects for this guy here. They can wow somebody who has a hitter that they've identified is going to be a member of their team. And it doesn't even necessarily have to be a prospect. They can go out and try to find players when teams are retooling and figure out what they're going to do in the offseason. So it's free agency and also the capital with all the pitching that they have. Sox in the Basement listeners, switch to a new age of life. Keep mom and dad, grandma and grandpa out of assisted living. Maybe you're getting older. You're trying to figure out how to get around the house. You're afraid that you might hurt yourself. You're living alone. It's all about getting around on your own, living independently. Stair lifts, ramps, grab bars, lift chairs, even bathroom remodeling, all at Hyatt Home Medical Equipment. They work with your insurance and have 0% financing for qualified individuals. And Hyatt also has the latest and greatest in CPAP machines. If you're unhappy with your vendor, switch now. Get supplies directly mailed to you. And if you're down on the south side, stop by the showroom. They have testing rooms and they'll show you all your options you probably don't even know about. They also have the latest in continuous glucose monitors and any medical equipment you can probably think of. See everything Hyatt Home Medical Equipment has to offer at hhme.com. Joining me on the phone line right now, Elijah Evans returns to the show from Just Baseball and FutureSox. He's a prospect head. A lot of times I just feel like guys like Elijah here just love the guys down in the minor leagues and can't wait to see all these White Sox players traded so they can see what they get back in return. But this week, it's great to talk with you, Elijah, because we had the draft, and you're the kind of guy I want to talk to find out whether or not it went well. How are you?
I'm doing well, Chris. Thanks for having me on, man. I mean, I'm definitely a prospect head and definitely excited for some of these prospects on the way. I was super dialed in the last 3 days on the draft. I've been kind of tweeting and writing about every single pick the White Sox have made, in addition to some other stuff. So it's been fun. I enjoy it. It's a great time of year. I think this is going to be it's already an exciting start to it, and then we've got a pretty big 2 weeks coming up here for the White Sox.
What did you think about the first overall pick? Because it surprised me they went pitcher, but as we've been talking about here on this episode, it almost signals they're going to go pitcher deep in their system because it's so hard to find and develop bats, so they'd rather be really good at pitching.
Yeah, that's exactly right, I think. I think that's on the right wavelength there. I mean, ultimately, I was surprised for sure. I got a little bit of a tip that it was coming prior to the draft. So I had an idea, and I was bracing myself a little bit that it was a big possibility. But, it's complicated, but at the same time, I think what they did was just look at the board and think about the fact that they think Hagen Smith is the best player on the board there. And ultimately, if he is the best player on the board there, you do that and you take that. And that's what's funky about the MLB draft. It's not like basketball. It's not like football. You're taking for talent here. And that's the reality. And you're maximizing within your 20 rounds. You're maximizing the total talent you can get within your allocated slot money. So it's really a complicated situation when you really look at the whole draft. But with Hagen, right, like, they drafted Garrett Crochet's replacement, and I know that's not what a lot of people want to hear, but they drafted a guy who will be up next year, if not immediately 2026, but probably sometime in 2025. This is one of the most advanced college pitchers in the past 5-10 years, and the guy was just unbelievably dominant all season. Left-handed guy. He's going to get even better when he works with Bannister and the rest of the pitching development staff. He's going to be a stud, and if they believe that this is the guy that they're sure is going to be a star major league player, I'm okay with that. And then you go high school with the next 2 picks, and then you prioritize bats and trades, right? And like getting a guy like Hagen Smith, in addition to the system that's already set up with pitching, like you have a really, really good pitching system. Like it's elite. It might be the best in baseball at this point, frankly. And now you're going to have to find a way to trade for some bats. And that's just the reality of it. But I'm not going to be upset about that yet, because I do think there's a really good chance they can get some superstar hitting prospects via the trade deadline.
You and I were talking right before you jumped on. Lots of pitching and some high ceiling outfielders. And that was kind of like your take of what they went for, or at least what they went and got. Overall, how did you feel? Because it sounds like day 1, okay, looks good. Day 2, what are they doing? Day 3, late in the draft, they did pretty well. Break it down for me.
Yeah, very fascinating draft. It was a weird kind of setup. So Hagen Smith first, right? Then you go to 2 high school guys. You get a high school shortstop and a high school pitcher. Both these guys with a ton of upside. Both are probably going to end up, it sounds to me from all indications from Shirley and from the media that those guys, Bonnemer and Larson, the 2nd and 3rd picks, are going to end up being overslot guys because they're high school, because they're so talented. They could go to college and get a ton of NIL money. So for those guys to sign at the 43rd and 68th picks, it sounds like you're going to be paying those guys a pretty good amount. I didn't mind the first few picks on day 2. I think Nick McLean in the 3rd round, big league bloodlines, brother of Matt McLean on the Reds, a guy that, it seems like a switch hitting, a lot of contact skills, really versatile outfielder, kind of dealt with some injuries, so really hasn't shown his full potential. But I didn't mind that pick overall. 5th rounder, Sam Antonacci. I kind of like that one. The best JUCO player in the country coming off of last year, went to Coastal Carolina, had a really good season there. It's kind of that Nick Magical light, and I don't even want to say magical because I don't want to put that on him, because that obviously did not pan out well. But in the 5th round, getting a guy that has unbelievable contact skills and needs to kind of you need to see that at the next level. Like, I'm okay with that because the contact skills are so good for him. He doesn't whiff at all, nothing but just getting on base all the time. That's a guy that I love taking there in the 5th round. If it was the 3rd round, 2nd, 3rd round, I'd be a little more hesitant. But in the 5th round there, I really like that pick. Basically 6 through 10 were all money saving picks. You go with a senior 5th year catcher in the 6th, 3 straight relief pitchers, 7, 8, 9, and then an outfielder from a small school who is talented. But, basically 6 through 10, the entire second half of day 2 yesterday was picks that should come in under slot, at or under slot. I think pretty much all 5 of those guys should have a chance to go under slot. I really like Phil Fox, though, relief pitcher out of Pittsburgh. Ridiculously good fastball metrics. That's a guy that probably can shoot through the system as a reliever, as a primary reliever. Aaron Combs closed down the College World Series this year for Tennessee, another relief pitcher, but both those two should move pretty quickly through the system. But in general, that 6 through 10 was really just a lot of money saving, which at first I was like, what is the purpose of this? Because in my mind, Hagen Smith should have been at or even under. Those high school guys should have been right around slot value, but it sounds to me like all 3 of those first picks are going to end up being rather expensive. So you had to save some money in 6 through 10, and they wanted to save some money for the later rounds, which came today. And then today, I really liked a lot of these picks today, it's funny how that goes. And that's kind of White Sox-esque in the past few years. I mean, when you look at the draft right now from the past few seasons, right, you've got guys like Mason Adams, guys like Brooks Baldwin, a lot of these guys that are now emerging as, some of the better prospects in the system that were taken on day 3 in the past 2 years. So it's really fascinating, the draft strategy from the White Sox. And it seems like it's almost becoming a trend where they work hard to allocate some money towards the early day 3 picks. And they did that today. You get a few different pitchers that are really interesting, probably relievers, Blake Shepperton and Pierce George, both in the 11th and the 13th. Those 2 guys just stuff. I mean, really nasty stuff from both those guys. Command work to do. Probably both of them are going to remain in the bullpen, but just disgusting stuff from both those guys. You get a few outfielders that with some serious experience and some pop. Nathan Archer, a small school Bowling Green guy. TJ McCants, who was an Old Miss guy for a few years with Jacob Gonzalez. Finished at Alabama this past year, just a ton of experience. You get another hitter in the 17th in Lyle Miller Green, who I had never heard of, but has some absurd power numbers, Chris. This guy hit multiple over 115 exit velocities this past year. A small school guy, not a ton of pedigree, already 23 years old, but like total Tim Elko, draft kit, right? Where like he hits the living crap out of the ball. He could easily just, shoot through the lower levels of the minors, and we'll see if he continues to improve, right? There's still more to do there, but a ton of power there. And then they get some more starting pitching too. They bulk up on some pitchers that are moldable and interesting. In the 14th, 15th, 18th, and 19th, they go a bunch of starting pitchers, just experienced for college starting pitchers. Justin Sinibaldi from Rutgers, Mason Moore from Kentucky, Liam Paddock from Gonzaga, Nick Pinto from UC Irvine. All 4 of those guys just experienced college guys. I really like Mason Moore, particularly from Kentucky. He had an incredible 2023 season, struggled this year, but getting him in the 15th round, a guy that, could have been a top 5 to 7 round guy the year before. I really like taking that kind of buy low on him. And then, the rest of those arms too are interesting as well. And then you go down at the 20th pick, which I'm trying to answer some, I was just a few minutes ago before we got on, I was answering some questions on Twitter about this, because the 20th pick, the White Sox go with the 145th ranked player in the entire draft class, right? So this is a guy that was, in terms of talent, ranked as a 4th round draft pick.
And they get him at 20, so they're going to have to overpay to get him to come there instead of going to college.
Yeah, so it's more complicated than that. Unfortunately, this is a guy that I would give it about a 5% chance he actually signs with the White Sox. It's just the situation here basically is that essentially the White Sox organization, and Shirley just said this in a press conference a few minutes ago, but essentially the organization is admitting that it's not admitting, right? There's nothing to admit, right? But it's a contingency plan. So getting a high school guy of that caliber in the 20th round, if you don't sign him, whatever, it's a 20th round pick, you burn a pick. It really is what it is at that point, and it's minimal money you're burning. But what happens is if you have a hard time signing any of the other guys in the earlier part of the draft, then you have a super, super high upside guy that you could allocate money towards if you have that leftover money from other guys not signing. So the reality is Miles Bailey's committed to Florida State. He's one of the better high school players in the country. He's probably going to go to college. But hypothetically, and this is not an ideal situation, but if something were to happen with any of some of these early, more expensive players that don't end up signing or they can't reach a deal with the White Sox, then you have a bunch of leftover money that you can throw at Miles Bailey and say, hey, we know you're a 20th round pick, but we're going to pay you like you're a 3rd round pick to come to this team to join us. We're going to give you the rest of our bonus money because we want you to come. We want you to play for us and we want you to develop in our system and not go to college, right? So that pick is very flashy and it seemed awesome. Like, 20th round, they finally took the high school kid. Because I was hoping, in that 6 or 10 range when they were taking all these underslot, senior signing college guys, I was like, that would be the time to pounce on a 3rd high school guy. The reality is they didn't think they had enough money. So Miles Bailey is kind of this contingency plan where if you don't sign 1 or 2 of the other guys, then you can throw some money at him.
All right, so there's a lot to take in there, but me listening to you, the way I get it is the first few guys are so valuable, they're going to have to spend a little bit more probably than slot for them. They had to then save a bunch of money on day 2, but they'd rather go get the guys that they want. And then they also saved a little bit of money so they could have some fun in the back end, and Miles Bailey is there in case anything goes wrong. You can sign him. Or if for some reason Miles Bailey doesn't care about money and just wants to play for a class organization like the White Sox.
That's a good one, Chris.
Yeah, I know. Exactly. All right, so you look at this class. You listen to Mike Shirley. You see Chris Getz's first draft. You understand the idea that Brian Bannister is turning this into a very pitching-heavy organization, and that's a good thing. And it looks like the direction is essentially we need to be really good with having arms because we may have to use them in the trade for bats at some point, and we may have to start spending the money in free agency on bats because we're going to be set with all of these arms. If I told you take a look at this entire list here, and you're not allowed to be excited about the first 3 guys because they're the first 3 guys and they should be good. After that, and I want to say it was a round 1, round 2, and a compensatory pick. After that, starting in round 3, what guy do you love the most? If somebody sat there and said, pick a guy that we expect to see in the major leagues contributing and you love them the most right now.
Oh, that you're putting me on the spot here. In terms of, floor, a guy that I think will develop quickly and is a more safe bet to reach than a lot of the other guys. I really like Mason Moore, 15th rounder out of Kentucky. That's a guy who just has experienced the high level right-handed pitcher. He struggled this season, but again, like I mentioned, he came into the year as a preseason All-American, right? So he was looking like he was going to be, a top, much higher pick than the 15th round. I'll put it that way. Struggled a lot this season. Came in the College World Series and dominated him in his start in the College World Series and looked like, the pitcher that he looked like in 2023. So there's a lot of ups and downs, but a 6'4" righty with a lot of stuff, natural ability to start, clearly can burn some innings. Like that's the guy that I can look at and say like he could be a starting pitcher from that back group. In terms of like some fun, like upside guys, Lyle Miller Green, the 17th rounder. I think a lot of people are quickly going to fall in love with him just because there's so much power there. We'll see what happens. He's listed as a 2-way player. He's not going to pitch. He's going to be a hitter long term. He's definitely got more upside at the plate. That's a guy that like you can dream on, right? Like that's the one person I think you can really dream on from that back group in terms of like he could be an excellent hitter if things click for him. And then in terms of the bullpen guys, there's a lot of different bullpen guys. I mean, they drafted probably 6 guys that are going to end up as relievers, which is really uncommon, honestly, for a draft. But Pierce George from Alabama, 13th round, 102 touches on his fastball, Chris. The guy has absolute juice in his stuff. Could not command all season for Alabama. That's kind of, he hasn't gotten a ton of college innings in big moments because his command has never come together. But when you get a chance to get a guy that throws 102 in the 13th round, and he's looked really good this college and collegiate summer ball, or this summer. So that's a guy that like, of all the bullpen guys, that's the one you can look at and say like, oh, that could be a closer if things really click and they can find a way to tune his command up.
It really seems like what the White Sox have done here is said, we're going to develop pitching at the lowest level, at the draft, and when we pick up prospects, and now we're going to fill in our bullpen too, because we're never going to spend $45, $50, $60 million on a bullpen again. That is just not the way we're going to do business. It'll be interesting to see what that translates to in the next couple of years. This will be an interesting draft to see how does this actually pan out, because it did feel different, right? Did you notice anything that made you feel like, hey, there's a new guy in charge, there's new people in charge of what's going on here?
Yeah, definitely different. You can feel the Bannister effect. I think Brian Bannister is the director of pitching development. You can feel the pitching focus, and you can feel the focus on pitchers that can be kind of molded in the White Sox form, right? Like we're seeing a lot of this in the farm system right now with guys who are, they're focusing on developing cutters. They're focusing on a lot of higher velocity guys as opposed to what they used to do, right? So there's a lot of signs here of like, we want to mold pitchers in our kind of pitching development angle, right? So like that is clearly the strategy here, is to focus on the pitching, to really nail that guys, and then to find a few guys that you think can become really good hitters and guys that are more advanced as hitters, right? Like they're going, other than Caleb Bonnemer, who's like the high upside high school guy with that second pick they take, right? The rest of the bats in this draft pretty much are a ton of experience, college developed hitters. They're not trying to develop hitters. They're trying to get guys who are kind of already developed and they can mold and they can shape a little bit, but guys that are more advanced than their peers, because ultimately this organization has not been great at developing hitters from a young age, right? Like obviously there's a few exceptions. There's some guys that have been great, but they are trying to take the angle of focusing on developing pitchers, getting hitters who are already pretty developed, and then also getting hitters via other teams that have developed in other systems, right? So like you're going to see at the deadline, like I'm not saying there'll be no pitchers acquired, but like almost all these trades at the deadline are going to be for hitting prospects who have already kind of started their development process within another organization that they can then take what they've grown into and kind of get that further in the White Sox system. It's tricky. It's definitely not the most standard just track and route to take, but I can see it. I can see the idea behind it.
Elijah Evans is with Just Baseball. He also does stuff with FutureSox. You're doing so much, man. You're everywhere. You're a great Twitter follow as well, or X follow. Follow him, Elijah Ev8. And I appreciate you jumping on Sox in the Basement. I hope that you can get some rest now after 3 days of just following the draft.
I am going to get some rest today, and then I got to record a few more pods tomorrow. But I appreciate having me on, Chris. It's always good to talk some White Sox, and I'm hoping we're going to see a lot of prospects that I love up in the White Sox, in the bigs in a few weeks here.
I want to bring up something that I think a lot of people missed when Mike Shirley, director of amateur scouting, was talking about Hagen. Because Hagen Smith, there's a lot of big things to say about him, a lot of stats. And he said this line, I don't think anybody really got what he was saying here. I have a theory about what he was saying. Despite all of his success, this is Shirley talking about his new number one or first round draft choice. I was struck most throughout the scouting process by his humility. We believe Hagen to be a foundational piece to what we are building in our organization in the years to come. Now, I don't think anybody got it the way I got it. When I read that line, I thought about a couple years back in that postseason game, the really exciting one where Larry Garcia ran into one and, it earned him a bunch of money. But like the way that the Astros in that series, like we kept sending out pitchers that all did one thing. And we have a new guy in charge of pitching development that wants more pitchers than throwers. And I believe that as it would be in any job, I guarantee you there are pitchers within the White Sox organization over the last couple of years and including this season that probably don't like being told they have to change what they do. Probably feel really good about what they are. Probably just think they've had some bad luck. Don't have the humility to follow the program. I think that's what that line means. I think the idea is, look, we want pitchers in here and we want players in here that will make adjustments to their swing, make adjustments to the way that they pitch, learn new things. We don't want to deal with anybody that doesn't do that. And there have probably been people that have been moved off this team already that don't like to listen to, you got to change this. And there are probably some more people that are probably going to be gone before we start off next season that are like that as well. That's how I read it when he had that line about humility.
Well, and that's an interesting thing because you think about Jacob Gonzalez, who was, last year's number one, and how he came in and retooled his swing and is having success in the minors. And we know that there were some things that were changed about him offensively. And there is something to be said about taking somebody who is coachable and wanting to do something that becomes sustainable so that you can plug guys in and you can have a certain philosophy and you can mold them into something that you want to do. Now, it remains to be seen if the White Sox will ever come up with a philosophy that actually sticks and works. The ability for Hagen Smith to sit there and say, okay, I'm not just fastball slider, which are his dominant pitches, but I can work on a changeup, a split change, or I can work on something new that gives me an interesting facet that makes me into something more. That's obviously one, to Hagen Smith's benefit, but two, it benefits the White Sox because then it's a little like Don Cooper teaching everybody a cutter back in the day, right? It's something that you can sit there and say, look, we can take this guy and we can take him to another level. And if you aren't going to pay for ready-made aces, then that's what you have to do. You have to take a guy who is an interesting ace-level prospect with the stuff he's already got, and you got to find a way to build him over the top and make him into something bigger and better, even if you're only going to have that bright, shiny star in your rotation for whatever years of controllability that you have under the CBA.
Another thing I wanted to point out before we head out of here, I do find it interesting that over the All-Star break, I'm starting to hear more and more from beat reporters like Scott Merkin and even national folks. After all this fervor that Garrett Crochet and Luis Robert Jr. were imminently going to be traded. Now everybody's saying basically what we've been saying. They don't need to trade these two guys. They're not trading them unless you knock their socks off. It's like, hey, they're available. You really have to overspend because we're not in a hurry and we don't have to. And their value may even increase before the beginning of next season or even before next year's trade deadline. And we don't know where we're going to be. So if you want them, you got to spend. And you continue to hear reports of a team knocking on the door and being immediately shut down. So I feel like this is very similar to the Cease thing. Everybody thought, well, he's got to be traded, but they didn't have to. And Chris Getz has even more wiggle room. I mean, he's got 2 more years after this season with Crochet and 3 more with Robert. He can sit back and wait, and I'm starting to hear that now more and more instead of these guys are getting traded. I think people are starting to understand that is not a foregone conclusion, and the White Sox don't really have to do it. And it could change very much so with the makeup of this team and what they are before next year's trade deadline or All-Star break or when somebody starts knocking on the door again.
Sox in the basement. Sox in the basement. Sox in the basement.
Sox in the Basement. Heard everywhere podcasts can be found and always on soxinthebasement.com.